In the arid expanse of the American Southwest, where deserts stretch for hundreds of miles and rain is a rare and precious visitor, there runs a single thread of water on which an entire civilization has come to depend. It is a lifeline in the truest sense of the word, a slender ribbon of blue winding through a vast and thirsty land, carrying the water that allows great cities to rise from the sand, that turns barren valleys into fields of green, that lights homes and cools desert nights and sustains the lives of tens of millions of people across a region that nature never intended to support so many. Without this lifeline, the Southwest, as we know, it could not exist. And now that Lifeline is disappearing, thinning year after year under the weight of drought and warming and relentless demand, carrying less water than it once did and less than the region has come to rely upon. This is the story of the Southwest Water Lifeline, of why it is fading, and of the millions of people whose lives could be affected as it does. Before we begin, one honest word about what all of this means. To say the Southwest's water lifeline is disappearing and that millions could be affected does not mean the region is about to collapse or that the taps will run dry tomorrow. It means the flow of water that sustains the Southwest is diminishing, that the security it long provided can no longer be taken for granted, and that the consequences of its decline could reach a vast number of people if the region does not adapt. Understanding what this lifeline is, why it is fading, and who depends upon it is the key to understanding the true shape of the water crisis in the American Southwest, and that understanding is what this video is here to provide. Real quick before we go further, a lot of people watch these all the way to the end, genuinely enjoy them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a small channel like ours alive: hitting subscribe. It is honestly important right now. Our sub rate is low and every single tap makes a real difference. So if you are finding this valuable, please subscribe right now. It takes 1 second and costs you nothing. And drop the name of your city in the comments so we can see who is watching. All right, let's begin. What the Lifeline is and why it matters so much to understand the crisis, we must first understand what this lifeline is and why so much depends upon it. The Southwest is one of the driest regions in the country, a land of deserts and mountains where the rain that falls is far too little to support the cities and the farms that have grown there. What makes life in this region possible is a great river, born high in the mountains where the winter snows accumulate, gathering the meltwater as it descends and carrying it down through canyons and across deserts on a long journey toward the sea. This river and the system of dams, reservoirs, canals, and aqueducts built to capture and distribute its water is the lifeline of the Southwest, the single most important source of water for an enormous region. The reason this lifeline matters so much is that there is so little else to rely upon. In a wetter region, a declining river would be one source among many, its loss cushioned by rainfall, by other rivers, by abundant groundwater. But in the Southwest, this one river carries a share of the region's water so large that no other source can readily replace it. It supplies the drinking water for great desert cities. It irrigates vast tracts of farmland that produce a significant portion of the nation's vegetables. Especially in the winter, it generates electricity as its water passes through the dams. And it sustains communities across several states and beyond the border. Tens of millions of people depend on this single system, their daily lives tied to the flow of one river through the desert. This concentration of dependence upon a single lifeline is what makes its decline so alarming. For when one thread carries so much, the fraying of that thread threatens everything attached to it. It is worth pausing to marvel at what this lifeline made possible, because the achievement is genuinely staggering, and it explains why the region grew so confident in the water it now finds slipping away. A century ago, much of the Southwest was empty desert, its harsh conditions permitting only small and scattered settlement. The taming of the great river changed everything. Enormous dams were raised across its canyons, holding back the water in vast reservoirs, and an intricate web of canals and aqueducts was built to carry that water hundreds of miles over mountains and across deserts to the places where it was needed. On the strength of this engineering, cities that had been little more than dusty outposts swelled into sprawling metropolises of millions. Glittering in the desert night, their fountains and lawns and swimming pools a defiant answer to the aridity all around. Farms spread across valleys that had known only sagebrush, becoming among the most productive agricultural land in the world. The whole edifice of modern life in the Southwest was built upon the assumption that the lifeline would always deliver, and for generations it did. So reliably that most people forgot it was there at all, forgot how thin and how precious the thread on which their world depended truly was. That forgetting is part of what makes the present crisis so difficult, for a region that took its water for granted must now relearn, quickly and under pressure, just how fragile its foundation has always been. The lifeline was never a natural abundance, but an engineered one, a triumph of human will over a stingy landscape, and its capacity was always bounded by what the river could provide. As long as the river ran high, the boundary went unnoticed, but now that it is running low, the boundary has become impossible to ignore. And the region is discovering that the security it felt was borrowed against a flow that could not last. Understanding the lifeline, then, means understanding both its greatness and its fragility, the astonishing achievement it represents, and the precariousness that was always hidden within it. Why the lifeline is disappearing, the disappearance of the Southwest Water Lifeline, is the result of a fundamental imbalance between what the river provides and what the region takes from it. An imbalance that has deepened over the years until it can no longer be ignored. The river was divided and allocated long ago, in an era when its flow was measured during an unusually wet period, so that the region came to expect and to depend upon more water than the river over the long run actually carries. From the beginning, then, the system promised more than the river could reliably deliver, and for a time the gap was hidden by the great reservoirs which stored the surplus of the wet years and covered the deficits of the dry ones. But over the past quarter century, a long and severe drought has gripped the region, one of the most persistent in centuries, and the river has run well below its historical average year after year. At the same time, the warming climate has intensified the drought and worked against the river in additional ways, shrinking the mountain snowpack that feeds it, causing that snow to melt earlier and more quickly, drying the soil so that more of the meltwater is absorbed or evaporated before it reaches the river, and lifting more water directly from the surface of the reservoirs into the warming air. The flow of the lifeline has diminished, and the great reservoirs that once buffered the region have been drawn down to levels that would have seemed impossible a generation ago, their capacity to cover the deficits nearly exhausted. Meanwhile, the demand has remained high, driven by growing cities and vast farms, so that more water is taken from the system than the river now provides. The result is a lifeline that is disappearing, its flow diminishing and its reserves depleting, as the gap between what the river gives and what the region takes grows wider each year. Quick question I would genuinely love your take on, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you know that so much of the Southwest depends on just one river system for its water? Drop a yes or a no in the comments, because your answers help me understand what surprises people most about this, and I read every single reply. Okay, back to it. The millions who depend on the lifeline to grasp the full weight of what is at stake. We must consider the millions of people whose lives are tied to this disappearing lifeline. For they are not an abstraction, but a vast and varied population spread across a great region. There are the residents of the great desert cities, the millions who live in the sprawling metropolitan areas that have grown into some of the largest and fastest growing in the nation, their homes and businesses supplied by water drawn from the river and its reservoirs. When they turn on their taps, when they drink and bathe and cook, they are drawing on the lifeline, most of them never thinking about the long journey that water has made or the fragility of the system that delivers it. There are the farmers whose fields depend on the river's water carried to them through canals and ditches, and who grow an enormous quantity of the food that feeds not only the region but much of the country, especially the fresh vegetables that fill the nation's tables in the cold months. There are the communities of many kinds spread across the region, including native peoples with deep and ancient ties to the river and long-standing rights to its water, whose livelihoods and cultures are bound up with the flow. There are the people beyond the border, in the neighboring country through which the river passes on its way to the sea, who also depend on a share of its water. And there is the electricity generated at the great dams, which powers homes and businesses across a wide region, so that even those who do not drink the river's water may depend on the power it produces. All told, the lifeline sustains tens of millions of people, and its disappearance threatens, in one way or another, every one of them. What makes this dependence so striking is how invisible it is to most of those who live within it. A family in a desert suburb watering the garden on a summer evening is drawing on water that fell as snow on distant peaks and traveled hundreds of miles through a vast and aging network of concrete and steel, yet they may never give it a thought. A shopper choosing fresh vegetables in a market far from the Southwest is eating food grown with the river's water, connected to the lifeline without ever knowing it. This invisibility is a measure of how well the system has worked so smoothly that it disappeared from awareness, but it is also a source of danger. For a people who do not see their dependence are slow to recognize its peril and slow to make the sacrifices needed to protect it. Part of the challenge of the crisis is simply making visible again a lifeline that decades of reliability had rendered invisible, so that the millions who depend on it can understand what is at stake and act accordingly. The sheer scale of the dependence also means that the effects of the lifeline's decline would not fall evenly, and some would feel them far sooner and more harshly than others. Those with the most junior claims to the water, the newest rights, and the weakest legal standing would face cuts first, while those with older and stronger claims would be protected longer. Rural farming communities whose whole economy rests on irrigation could be devastated by reductions that a large city, with its diversified economy and its capacity to invest in alternatives, might absorb more easily. And the communities with the fewest resources, whether rural towns or native nations long denied their full share, could find themselves least able to adapt. The disappearance of the lifeline, in other words, would not be a single uniform blow, but a cascade falling unevenly across a vast and varied population, striking hardest at those least equipped to withstand it. And this uneven vulnerability is part of what makes the crisis so fraught. Quick pause, because this part matters and it deserves to be seen by more people. If you are getting real value from this, tap the like button. It genuinely helps the video reach others who care about where their water comes from. And if you have family or friends anywhere in the Southwest, share this with them. Because it honestly matters that the people who depend on this water understand what is happening to it. One like, one share to someone in your family, and let's keep going. What happens as the lifeline fades, the consequences unfold gradually at first and then more sharply, touching the cities, the farms, the power supply, and the delicate agreements that hold the whole system together. The first and most immediate effect is felt in the great reservoirs, whose falling levels threaten the generation of electricity at their dams, because the power depends on the water being high enough to flow through the turbines with sufficient force. If the water falls too low, that generation is reduced or could cease, removing a source of power on which a wide region relies. And beyond that lies an even graver threat, the possibility that the reservoirs could fall so low that water can no longer be reliably released downstream at all, a scenario that would strike at the very heart of the region's water supply. Long before that extreme is reached, however, the fading of the lifeline forces painful choices about how to share a shrinking supply. The states and the many users who depend on the river must negotiate reductions, deciding who will give up how much of the water they have long relied upon. And these negotiations grow harder and more contentious with each round as the cuts required grow deeper. Agriculture, which uses the largest share, faces the greatest pressure to reduce, and that means fields left fallow, crops changed, and rural economies strained. The cities face restrictions and rising costs as they conserve and search for new sources. The communities with rights to the water, including native peoples, must fight to see those rights honored as the supply shrinks. And the tension among all these users, each dependent on a lifeline that can no longer satisfy them all, grows sharper as the water diminishes. The fading of the lifeline is thus not a single event, but a cascade of consequences, spreading through every part of the region that depends upon it, and testing the ability of a vast and varied population to adapt to a future with less water than it has come to expect. All right, I know this is the second time I am bringing this up. You can roll your eyes at me. But honestly, if you have made it this deep into a video about the Southwest's water, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you watching still have not subscribed. I am not going to make you feel bad about it, but that one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel fighting a low sub rate. It really does matter to us. That is the last time I will ask, promise. Let's finish. Can the lifeline be saved? The question that hangs over the entire region is whether the lifeline can be saved, whether the flow can be brought back into balance with the demand before the consequences become severe. And the answer, though difficult, is not one of despair. The lifeline cannot be made to carry more water than the river provides. And the river's flow is diminishing under forces largely beyond the region's control, so the path to saving the lifeline runs not through increasing the supply, but through reducing the demand and stretching every drop further. The single most important step is bringing the region's use of water into balance with what the river can actually deliver. And because agriculture uses by far the largest share, this means difficult changes in farming in which crops are grown, how efficiently the water is used, and how much land is irrigated, changes that carry real costs but that hold the greatest potential to close the gap. Alongside this, the region is pursuing other paths. It is investing in conservation, wringing more use out of every drop through efficiency in the cities and on the farms. And the great desert cities have become world leaders in using water wisely, some of them reducing their total use even as their populations grow. It is turning to new sources, to the recycling of water so that it can be used again, and to the removal of salt from seawater and brackish groundwater, sources that do not depend on the fading river. And it is working through difficult negotiation to share the reductions fairly and to manage the great reservoirs so as to keep them from falling to the most dangerous levels. None of these steps alone is sufficient. And together they demand sacrifice and cooperation on a scale that is hard to achieve, but they offer a genuine path toward a future in which the lifeline, though thinner than before, can continue to sustain the region. There is reason for cautious hope in the fact that the region has faced hard limits before and found ways to live within them. The great desert cities, once symbols of profligate water use, have in many cases transformed themselves into models of efficiency, tearing out thirsty lawns, recycling water on a vast scale, and holding their total consumption steady or even reducing it while their populations climbed. This proves that deep change is possible, that a society can learn to do more with less water when it decides it must. And it suggests that the demand side of the equation, the side the region can actually control, has more room to give than pessimists sometimes assume. The harder frontier is agriculture, where the largest volumes of water are and where change is most disruptive to livelihoods and communities. But even there, new methods of irrigation, shifts in the crops grown, and arrangements to compensate farmers for using less all offer ways to reduce the draw on the lifeline without simply destroying the agricultural economy. The path is narrow and the choices are painful, but it exists, and the region's own recent history shows that it can be walked. What happens to the Southwest's water lifeline will depend on the choices the region makes in the years ahead, on whether it can summon the will to bring its demand into balance with a diminished supply, to invest in conservation and new sources, and to share the shrinking water fairly among all who depend upon it. The lifeline is disappearing, and millions could be affected. But the story is not yet written, and the same extraordinary ingenuity and determination that built this civilization in the desert, that raised great cities from the sand and made the barren valleys bloom, can be turned now to the task of sustaining them through an age of less water. The river will not carry what it once did, and the region must learn to live within the limits of what remains. But if it does so with wisdom and foresight, the lifeline can endure, and the millions who depend upon it can continue to make their lives in this remarkable and demanding land. The fading of the lifeline is a warning, but it is also a summons, and how the Southwest answers it will determine the future of one of the great regions of the country for generations to come. The water that made this civilization possible is growing scarce, but the qualities that put it to use, the vision, the daring, and the resolve have not disappeared, and they remain the region's greatest resource as it confronts the hardest test in its history. Whether the lifeline endures